Hello and welcome to Unsupervised Thinking, a podcast on neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and science more broadly. We are a group of computational neuroscientists. I'm Grace.
I'm Josh.
I'm Connor.
And the topic for this episode is the neuroscience of sleep. And so for that, we have read a paper called Sleep State Switching by Clifford Saper. It was in Neuron in 2010. And thanks to David Zhou for recommending that. And then we also read what I would call a slightly more speculative paper called Rem Sleep and Dreaming towards a theory of proto-consciousness. But I would also say that it was a proto-theory.
Proto-theory of proto-consciousness. That's cool.
So that was by J. Allen Hobson, and that was in Nature Neuroscience Review 2009. So getting right into it, I think we should start by laying kind of the vocabulary, the different stages of sleep. We're going to kind of talk about the different stages, talk about the purpose of sleep, and then we will get into the actual neurobiology of kind of how you go from being awake to being asleep and to being in different stages of sleep and that kind of thing.
And will we talk about the consciousness at the end, or?
Yeah, we'll try to talk about the consciousness and what is claimed to be the role of dreaming and that kind of thing. We'll give that a go.
Okay.
Okay, so humans spend a third of their life asleep. Some people find that a depressing statistic. I love it. I love being asleep and going to sleep. And smaller... Wait, that's a sign of depression, isn't it? I don't care. Smaller animals spend up to half of their life asleep, including rodents that would be studied in laboratories. So a lot of the stuff about sleep, there are kind of parallels between humans and rodents, but certain of the numbers are kind of off. So basically, I mean, it's intuitive what sleep is, but there's obviously big differences in your state between waking and sleeping, in heart rate and temperature and movement and all of that kind of stuff. And so these things are kind of related to the breakdown in how different stages of sleep are defined. So basically when you're awake, if someone takes an EEG, so puts electrodes on your heads and records the oscillations, being awake is associated with high frequency, low voltage EEG signals. So like a really jagged line that doesn't look like it has a lot of obvious oscillations. And then as you fall asleep, the frequency becomes lower, so there becomes slower and higher voltage oscillations, so things that actually kind of look like waves, and that is called non-rapid eye movement sleep. That's the stage of sleep that the type of sleep that you enter as you first fall asleep. And over some period of time, these oscillations become even slower, and after about 40 minutes to an hour in humans, the first non-rapid eye movement sleep stage stops, and you enter a rapid eye movement stage. And so that transition between wake to sleep and then non-REM to REM, those transitions happen pretty quickly. They usually take 1% of the time as the amount of time that you spend in that state. So it can take a couple seconds in rodents and 10 seconds to a minute or so in humans to transition between these states. And then once you're in rapid eye movement sleep, the EEG signal again becomes a low voltage, high frequency signal that looks more like the awake state. And this is the stage of sleep that's most commonly associated with dreaming. And another aspect of this stage is that basically your muscle tone goes away, you don't move, and except for your eyes. So that's where the name comes from. The rapid eye movement sleep is because if you look at a person, their body would be still, but their eyes you could see would be going back and forth underneath their eyelids.
Grace, do you know these EEG patterns and the actual eye movement thing are like very tightly correlated?
Yeah, it's supposed to be, that this is kind of, all of these things go together, and when you switch between these states, it's kind of all of these different components are being switched.
Right.
So, I mean, right now we're kind of starting with just the descriptions of what sleep is and what it looks like. And I think it is worth remarking, as many people have done before, and certainly people do when they study sleep, how strange this phenomenon actually is when you think about it. Like, you've got an animal that has to survive in, like a world that's like not super easy to survive in. And it spends significant amounts of time immobile, non-responsive to sensory stimuli, and you get these extra sort of weird components of your brain starts doing something very, very abnormal. Your eyes are moving, and you dream. So I mean, just the descriptively, we're all like so familiar with sleep that it seems maybe familiar, and it's easy to overlook how kind of strange some of its phenomenology are. But like thinking about it from a scientific perspective, like I think it's worth remembering how kind of weird some of these components are.
Yeah, it's definitely very remarkable that it's required. And I always think like, I mean, there must be something really quite important and interesting about it, given that, we spend whatever 30% of our lives in this highly vulnerable state.
Yeah, and part of kind of the design element of the system that switches between sleep and wakefulness that we'll talk about later is kind of this idea of you want, when you're asleep, to be able to stay asleep and not wake up at any tiny, movement or sound. But at the same time, you do need, if something actually important is happening, you do need that to break through and cause you to wake up. So kind of that balance is something that has to be achieved by the neural circuits. So the second paper that talks about REM sleep and dreaming kind of highlights a lot of the roles of REM sleep. So throughout the night, you'll go through cycles of REM and non-REM. Probably, I think, like 4 or 5 cycles a night is usual. And you can, in laboratories, they can disrupt either REM or non-REM sleep by monitoring the EEG and waking people up if they are in one state or another. So they can do experiments that target different types of sleep and measure the effect that depriving people of that kind of sleep has. And so REM sleep is associated with many different problems if you're deprived of it. So, for example, without REM sleep, eventually people die, and it's a death via a lack of caloric and thermal control. So your body stops being able to control kind of its energy supply and how it uses its energy, and that will cause people to die. Interestingly, REM sleep is something that not all animals have. Like most animals sleep. Maybe not all animals sleep. A lot of animals sleep. And REM sleep, they believe, came about in pretty early mammals. So it's been around for like 150 million years or something like that. And it also evolved separately in birds. And mammals and birds are the animals that have to thermoregulate their body. So there seems to be this correlation between REM sleep and being able to thermoregulate. So that's an interesting connection.
Apparently, according to sleep.org, while scientists can't say for certain that every animal sleeps, most creatures in the animal kingdom do.
All right.
That's so useless. No, I'm going to find the real answer. Carry on.
I think people even try to make claims about like plants sleeping because they're different in the night or something, but
What?
we don't have to talk about
They
that.
don't have brains, for God's sake.
And and if you deprive people of REM sleep for a few days, they'll have cognitive decline. And then also there's this idea that if you're deprived of it, your body will try to make up for it. So if you wake people up during their REM sleep, on the first night that you do this, you may have to wake them up, like 5 times. They try to go into REM sleep 5 times. After a few days of depriving them of the REM sleep, you'll see that their body attempts to go into REM sleep more rapidly, and you'll have to wake them up, 50 times in a night because the body keeps trying to go back to REM sleep. So there's kind of this notion of a debt where whatever type of sleep you're lacking, or if you're lacking sleep overall, your body will try to make up for it.
Which we feel as fatigue of some. I mean,
yeah, but it's different because
Right.
the fact that it's the particular type of sleep is something.
No, the fact that it's a specific type of sleep is interesting. But I mean, I think like it's almost an obvious.
Yeah.
When you don't sleep, you try to go back to sleep.
Okay, I should also say with the cognitive decline and the REM sleep, that's also true for non-REM sleep. You'll see cognitive decline if you deprive people of non-REM, and they'll try to get more non-REM. But there's also a believed association between sleep and learning. So if you are learning a new task, like they have experiments where animals are learning new tasks, there's a claim that REM sleep increases after that. And that also if you disrupt REM sleep, the learning will be impaired. But this article claims that those effect sizes are small and not totally reliable. But I thought that connection was more strong. But I don't know, maybe it's not REM specific, or This is from 2009. So
well, so
maybe there's
this
been
was
more.
saying I mean, right, so there's lots of like presumably like you show lots of deficiencies, but the claim is just, do you need sleep to consolidate memory, right? Essentially that's what the question is. And they talk about there being a difference for procedural versus semantic memory, right?
Yeah, so like a memory of how to do something versus memory of facts or whatever.
Yeah.
And the sleep is supposed to be more for procedural memory.
Yeah. So your explicit knowledge doesn't require sleep to consolidate it, apparently, but like your ability to repeat a task maybe shows some effect. Yeah, I mean, I think like in undergraduate courses this is kind of talked up a lot, so I think maybe we've all heard that this is quite salient. I don't think any of us have looked so deeply into the primary literature on this, though.
Yeah, that's true. You see a lot of it kind of in popular science articles, like, if you don't sleep, you'll not be able to remember things, and you should sleep before taking an exam instead of studying late into the night. These are the things that people tell you.
But presumably just to be clear, right, if you're not getting sleep, presumably your memory, your recall of things you already knew would also be impaired, because you do show these deficits. So it's this subtle point of like memory consolidation. Does it, like, of things you just learned, does it require or not require a sleep?
Versus like, is recall impacted by fatigue the next day? Okay. Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. I don't know the distinction there exactly.
Yeah.
Apparently, just to come back to this, so I looked up an actual proper paper by some person from UCLA, but it's from 2008. Anyway, saying that some animals never exhibit a state that meets the behavioral definition of sleep. Others suspend or greatly reduce sleep behavior for many weeks. Blah, 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 blah. Some marine mammal species do not show evidence for REM sleep, and convincing evidence for this state in reptiles, fish, and insects is lacking.
For REM sleep, specifically.
Yes. But they also claim that some animals never exhibit a state that meets the behavioral definition of sleep. I don't know which animals.
Yeah.
Another funny point from this, though, I'm sorry, this is unrelated, but it's really funny. It says here in the beginning, like, a Google search for the phrase "do all animals sleep" brings up only 327 hits, and I was like, that can't be true. So I googled it. It's like 12 million hits, but this paper is from 2008. Like, things were really different only 10 years ago when it comes to.
Yeah, I'm surprised by that. They should have normalized that by some other search so that it would remain a relevant statistic.
What were they thinking?
So I think now, though, like, how many did you say it was now?
12 million.
Okay, but I think now they're like so large as to be like estimates, right? They're like not like if it really said like, oh, you got 50 hits, like you would be able to look through them and see them. But for the very large numbers, I don't even know if they're exact.
Yeah.
Oh, sure. Yeah,
Right.
Maybe it's not the best measure of something's importance or knowledge is the number of Google
certainly not
results.
anymore, right?
Certainly not anymore, yeah.
Something kind of surprising that goes a little bit against the idea that sleep is like all good is there's this claim, I mean, this is complicated, but the claim that depriving someone of REM sleep for a night can increase their mood if they're depressed, and also a lot of popular antidepressants actually do decrease REM sleep. So, I mean, obviously there's could be confusing mechanisms for why that would be so, particularly in depressed people. But it's just kind of in the opposite direction of all the other findings that are like, yay, REM sleep. And then also, so like touching on kind of a theory for the importance of REM sleep and this notion that REM sleep kind of is in some ways more like an awake state than it is like non-REM sleep, is this theory that it's kind of like your brain needs, for it to have the right neural connections, it needs kind of activity-dependent changes to happen. So you need your brain to be kind of experiencing things even when it's not experiencing things for the purposes of kind of training your neural networks. And this is, I think, comes in part from the idea that fetuses spend a lot of time in REM sleep, and in other animals, REM sleep sometimes only happens in infants, or it happens more when people are younger. And so it's this idea that, like, before you fully experience the world, your brain is still kind of creating experiences for itself to learn from.
Mm-hmm.
And also there are now some like notions in artificial intelligence, right, that try to use some sort of colloquial notion of this, where experiences that you've collected, you might try to like re-experience or replay to like sort of train yourself to produce the stereotypical version of the learning thing that we said may or may not actually have much evidence supporting it, right? Is that like maybe you swing a baseball bat during the day or a golf club that you're trying to get good at your stroke, and then in the evening when you sleep, you're like you consolidate that somehow by like the neural activity patterns that were responsible for generating that stroke like reactivate, and you get like practice essentially in your sleep. And I mean, I think there's lots of sort of popular sort of mainstream notions about like, oh, you can like learn a foreign language while you're asleep by just hearing it, you know, or something. And it's these notions which, true or false, I think in many cases false, are basically related to the idea that the pathways that are active during the day while trying to learn something can be, you know, reactivated and re-triggered, like essentially training that system. And the same notion has been, at least at that level of resolution, you know, adapted to AI note.
Yeah, like to train a neural network, you might store some experiences and replay them to it later or something like that. But also even simpler than that, because obviously that requires that you've had experience. So in like the fetus case, I think it's more just generating patterns of neural activity that are kind of plausible, that have like some slight constraints that match the statistics of what you would experience if, you know, your eyes were open and you were seeing things. So it's just about like having patterns of neural activity that are kind of more, you know, not these slow oscillations where everything's kind of predictable and going together, but kind of having, you know, more complicated patterns of neural activity go into the network to get it to have the right kind of connections and stuff.
I mean, there's also, this is like somewhat related to the idea that you can practice skills while awake by thinking about them, you know? Which I
by
think
like
is,
doing like motor imagery or something like
right,
this.
Right. Like, yeah, think about swinging the baseball bat 5,000 times and like exactly how you would do it or whatever and how it would feel and blah, blah. I think that's
I
accepted
see. So this,
make it.
yeah, and I mean, a lot of these things are like, have gotten into like alternative psychology or like self-help, right? I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
As notions of, like tell yourself or visualize I guess visualization is this big poppy topic.
Let's not like cross over into like the secret territory.
Yeah, no,
like
I mean,
make a vision board.
Well, I think
and pray to Oprah.
I mean, clearly these things, like at any, it's clear to me. I mean, this is kind of a more general point, right? It's clear to me that like at any time in our understanding of something, people will kind of, the way I think about this is people will like branch off from mainstream science. Like they go to school and learn some mainstream science or even get a PhD or whatever, or even do some research. And then as soon as that gets like kind of slow or not exciting or something like that, they decide they're going to just take the knowledge that they have and start trying to promote their own like kind of made up ideas that derive loosely from the knowledge that they have. So it's like, take some nugget of science, like, oh, you know, maybe while you're asleep, things get replayed, and decide you're going
create
to
like hypnosis tapes where you whisper to people while they're asleep.
Yeah.
And claim that it'll help them.
And I feel like the study of sleep has now been going on for like a century, and there have been probably lots of weird, like fringe branches of it in the 20th century that are responsible for...
Yeah, it lends itself to fringe, obviously.
Yeah, because it's so still, like despite having been studied for a while, it's still unknown really what its roles are. I mean, there are notions, but...
And it's so creepy. Like you're unconscious for a while and then you have like vivid conscious experiences that you've made up. Like...
And the temperature thing is also quite weird when you think about it. Like that your body temperature just changes dramatically.
Yeah, that's true. And heart rate and breathing and all of those things. It really is a weird,
really
weird thing. I might be on board with the alt theories. This is weird. This stuff is weird.
Wait, so you're on board with the made-up theories that people have?
Any made-up theory I'm willing to go with because it's so weird.
Well, no, but
it's
there's
like
a problem.
how connecting quantum mechanics with consciousness. Like if it's weird, you know, it all goes together, everything goes. Let's go with it.
I mean, to be fair, there is also a thing, which is that like, I mean, maybe you just think I'm losing it because I'm bored of neuroscience, but like there is something like appealing about people who are willing to be speculative, right? Because academia can be very stultifying. I mean, that doesn't have to mean that you start writing self-help books, like, but it could be that you...
If you're not making money off of it.
It's possible to be speculative and a bit mad and actually do, like, studies and, like, get through the boredom of, like, doing them and so on, you know?
the question comes down to, this is again like kind of an interesting broader question, is can you be both rigorous in what you're doing and yet like imaginative or speculative or visionary or whatever, like with notions that you haven't committed to, like you hold them with like the appropriate low levels of confidence. The only thing I would say, right, is it would seem like most of the people who try to be speculative or visionary, like in order for it even to be worth communicating those ideas publicly, they have to at least present as though those notions are plausible enough to warrant them writing them down and someone else spending time consuming them, right? Which is almost like more confidence than they should rationally have. So it's just like they're thinking about things and say like, hey, wouldn't this be a cool idea if true? But then in order to, so like, this like the ideas between, the link between quantum mechanics and consciousness, I would maybe throw in this camp, or maybe the link between sleep and consciousness, I would throw in this camp, right? It's like, I don't know how these things work. So the person presenting this link between sleep and consciousness is a person who's studied sleep for decades. This person presumably knows quite a bit about sleep, but obviously, like the rest of us, they don't know so much about consciousness.
What you have to do in order to get other people to listen is very much a function of like the time and place that you live in, right? Like the culture of, say, science at a given time. You could imagine a scientific culture where not everybody or something, where like you can be more speculative and imaginative, but you don't need to be dishonest about it. And then you can use it to inform very long-term research efforts, where you don't have to have all these distorting things of like needing to sell yourself.
Again, the question though about distortion is complicated because you could now, as a scientist, write like a paper saying, I have very little evidence to believe, but here is my entirely speculative notion about such and such.
And that's what this some of these pieces that we read sometimes are, like perspective pieces or opinion pieces are meant to be that.
I don't think that that's what it is, because if you're as honest as like, this is my totally speculative idea, like people shouldn't really necessarily waste their time reading it. Like,
they can if they think it'll be fun,
or it'll be just interesting. I mean, like I think.
Well, it could be interesting the way we read fiction about the stories that
I think
other
it could
people.
Be interesting for in terms of like generating ideas. I mean,
ideas. Okay.
I think that like probably there. I mean, I think there are examples of this that are well known, of people who were willing to go out on a limb, but then usually like followed it up, right, with like being like, oh, these are just like motivations, and then you follow it up with like 20 years of like slow.
Yeah, everything
research.
Was speculative to begin with. And there is, in regards to this topic, there are studies that look at imagery's ability to make you better at physical tasks, and they find, some effects under certain circumstances. There was stuff that was looking at the connection between regular dreaming and daydreaming and seeing like brain areas involved with both, and if they both kind of tend towards the same content and that kind of stuff to make that connection. So, like, something can be speculative and fuzzy in its first pass and then be fleshed out.
Be refined. Yeah, of course. And there's obviously, as you just mentioned, much research to substantiate some of the things that we're presenting as initially speculative claims.
Right. Okay, where were we?
Good question. I think maybe it's on to the actual neurobiology that underlies sleep states and switching between them and all of that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think so far we've done a pretty good job of describing sleep, remarking on how strange it is, and kind of getting a sense of like what kind of stuff goes on, and what maybe motivating why it seems interesting. And then the neuroscience questions are essentially if there are these different stages of sleep and they're kind of discrete, and there's all these things that like are behaviorally different about it, like your temperature dropping, like your like sort of paralysis, like your lack of ability to respond to sensory stimuli, then the next potentially interesting set of questions that arise are, how does the brain regulate the switching between sleeping states, and what parts of the brain control these different behavioral changes?
Yeah, and this will be a time where I mispronounce a bunch of brain regions. because so a lot of this, a lot of times, especially the types of topics that we talk about are very like cerebral hemisphere focused, like, the top of the brain kind of stuff. And this is all brainstem, midbrain, lower brain area stuff. The stuff that's like
cool.
on the stalk that holds the rest of the brain up. Yeah, it is. And it's weird because those areas kind of seem like they're so crucial to so many like parts of like bodily regulation in terms of, many different things, heart rate and food and sleep and all of that kind of stuff. And I feel like they don't get a lot of focus in neuroscience anymore, partly because they're like better understood than the more cognitive areas because they were the focus of neuroscience for a long time in the past. So it was kind of fun to go back and read about these. It really it took me back to my youth because when I was...
youth.
Yeah.
You're so ancient now, Grace.
This is like 9 years ago or something. It was when I was a freshman in college. I took a intro neuroscience course that was you were supposed to read papers. It was supposed to teach you how to read neuroscience research papers. But like all of the papers were from the professor who was running it. They're like his papers from the 60s about the hypothalamus and regulating body temperature and food intake and all that kind of stuff. And so all these words that we'll talk about kind of took me back to that.
I kind of like, and this is a vague thing, I kind of like this thing of studying these brain stem areas in connection with potentially higher level functions, because there's a potential lesson if it's true or not. I think this is where, low level areas that we think of as low level that probably did originally evolve to kind of take care of certain pretty low level things like, regulating temperature or, basic kind of internal function. Can end up being involved with higher level functions via connectivity with newer kind of brain areas. So it's not necessarily that we usually think of this kind of linear progression of the brain, like you add more and more complex areas, and then it's like, which kind of somehow leads to this idea that like the prefrontal cortex is like where all the funky shit happens. But that's I think that's not really kind of that accepted, and there's lots of theories now that are more about like connectivity, and it can be that there's these low level processes get kind of co-opted or adapted in their connectivity with higher level brain areas to be involved with things like dreaming and stuff. I mean, again, I just thought that's kind of an interesting theme that you see sometimes.
Yeah, and this is a particularly good example because, as we said, REM sleep is kind of something that came about with mammals, but I think a lot of these brain areas have like analogous regions in reptiles and other things. So these seem like the kind of brain areas that were already there, and then something like REM sleep kind of came from them later on. So kind of the way this plays out is that there are basically different regions and different neurons that are considered wake regions, like regions where the neurons are more active during wake, and then there's neurons in certain regions that are more active during sleep, and maybe particularly REM sleep or non-REM sleep, depending on the area. And so, the story of this is that there are all these different areas, and these different neurons have different properties, and then they're kind of interconnected in a way that allows for a push-pull relationship between the different states. So to start with some of the wake areas, the areas where the neurons are active during wakefulness, there are two areas. One is the pedunculopontine, and the other one is the latero-dorsal tegmental nuclei. I guess they're both nuclei. And so they fire during wakefulness and during REM. So as we said, REM kind of looks like wakefulness if you're looking at like the EEG. And so these neurons are active during wakefulness and during REM sleep. And they're cholinergic, so they release acetylcholine. The ones in the lateral-dorsal tegmental area fire a lot before the transition from slow wave sleep to fast wave sleep. So it might be kind of signaling the transition between non-REM and REM. And it was known since 1949 that stimulating kind of parts of the brain around these areas create wakeful-looking EEG signals. And then there are also neurons in the locus coeruleus and the dorsal and median raphe nuclei. They release different neurotransmitters. These are active during wakefulness. They're less active during non-REM sleep and they're off during REM sleep. So this has a different pattern. They're still on during wakefulness like the cholinergic ones, but they're off during REM sleep, whereas the cholinergic ones are on during REM sleep, which is kind of important because if like every part of the brain looked the same between wakefulness and REM sleep, it would be really confusing because obviously REM sleep still is very different from wakefulness. So this is an area where there's a differentiation between wakefulness and REM sleep.
So what is the, let's clarify, like what is the point of having these descriptions? The point is you're observing the brain and you're trying to assess what are the differences in the neural activity during these different sleep states. So this is not a mechanism. This is like, so far we're getting into the first pass, which is just like, okay, what are the neural differences in activity during the different kinds of, sleep and wakefulness states?
Right. Yeah, it's like all neuroscience. The first pass is to say this area does this thing. And then you realize that that's too simplistic and everything's connected to everything else. And so it's complicated and you need to understand it as like a mechanism with causal relationships.
And here they're already like part of how they're identifying the different areas is not just by where they are. It's partly by where they are in the brain, but it's also they're identifying populations of neurons as releasing particular neurotransmitters. And also they speak a little bit about where these neural populations project to in the brain.
Yeah, so like the cholinergic ones project to the thalamus and indirectly project to the cerebral cortex, and then the monoaminergic ones project to particularly the prefrontal cortex, which is a part of the cerebral cortex. But they also go many other places. This is part of the complication with these brain areas in particular, is that everything's like a mess. Like there's different cell types next to each other. Everything projects to everything else. It's very messy from my perspective, right, as someone who likes to build clean, simple models.
So in part, the like brain area description of these things, because of the details of where they connect to and what neurotransmitter they release, can be misleading if you're trying to record the activity of those neurons, because you put your electrode in and you don't know if you're recording from a neuron that releases, acetylcholine or some other neurotransmitter, but you might want to know that.
Yeah. So it complicates things. Obviously that's something else that people do in these kinds of studies are like lesions or activating regions or temporarily inactivating regions and that kind of thing. So those things suggested that these two areas that I listed are important for wakefulness, but also you can get rid of these areas. And after a few weeks to a few months, a sleep-wake cycle will be reinstated in the animal or the person who has damage in these areas. So that pointed to the fact that there must be other areas of the brain that, while normally aren't like the driving factors for the sleep-wake cycle, can come to take on that role if they need to. So another set of neurons that I think is kind of related to this idea that there's redundancy in this system are the orexin neurons in the hypothalamus. They're also called hypocretin. There's different names for what they secrete based on who found them and what they thought the purpose was at the time. And they send axons all over the cerebral cortex and the brainstem. And this is kind of common for even like in the study of attention or general different levels of arousal during wakefulness. You see this like signature of modulating systems that they just send axons everywhere because it's like a whole brain state that they're trying to regulate. So this is a set of neurons that send axons like all over the place. And they get input from the two areas that I just listed. And they also get input from the amygdala and the cortex, and they get input that's related to reward. So this is kind of a way of connecting, we kind of associate different things. Like sleep isn't just, are you awake or are you asleep? Like you can be awake and you can be tired, you can be awake and you can be really engaged and aroused, and there's different levels even of wakefulness. And so this is kind of a way where that stuff gets integrated here because you have signals about reward going in here. These orexin cells are also driven by low glucose levels. So like if you're hungry, it's supposed to, I guess, wake you up and make you alert so that you can try to find food. So it kind of is integrating different systems into the wake-sleep cycle system.
The the orexin system is known to be also related to food-seeking behavior, and so it's probably an oversimplification that we're just taking it slightly out of context to oversimplify it. That this is entirely about wake-sleep regulation, right? There are overlapping hypothalamic nuclei that are involved in sleep and involved in other kinds of behaviors.
Yeah,
right?
just to be clear, everything I'm saying is an oversimplification.
Well, no,
Yeah.
I mean, of course it's an oversimplification, but it's just like the same neurons that are secreting orexin here
Right.
for sleep regulation are going to be involved in explicitly food-seeking behavior in another overlapping system.
Lots of other things. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, so this complicates the study of sleep in a way because so people saw that if you activate these orexin neurons, you can cause an animal to wake up. And if you destroy them, you can cause an animal to have narcolepsy, to kind of like be falling asleep whenever. But that doesn't obviously mean that these are like so crucial in sleep, or these are like the primary sleep related neurons, because like if you activate the hair cells in someone's ears, you will cause them to wake up because they'll think that they're hearing a loud sound. Like there's so many things that feed into a system, it's hard to define what is like the core parts of the system and what are things that are related to that system but not core to it.
Yeah, and I think I mean, this point is worth dwelling on for a second, like especially for people who are not familiar with reading lots of neuroscience papers, which is that like it can be kind of weird when you listen to talks about neuroscience, or you read papers, or you read popular science articles. Like you'll hear the same brain areas being mentioned in lots of different contexts, and at least when I was starting off, I kind of was like, what's this deal? Like, why do I hear this brain area being kind of mentioned in these like seemingly completely different situations? But that just is part of the reality of where the state of the research is. Like, so the locus coeruleus, for example, one of the brain areas here, will be mentioned in lots of other situations, like to do with various kind of clinical problems like depression and PTSD and stuff. And yeah, the answer to that, we don't know why that is the case. Like there might be really intimate connections between, say, like sleep wake. You can imagine how sleep wake could be related to depression or something, insofar as it's about like motivation and so on. You can always make up these kinds of these stories, but like part of the kind of the part of what will constitute progress in the field is like actually disentangling all these different things, and having more detailed descriptions of what it means for particular brain areas to be involved in particular things. Is it and so on. But the point being just that it is a real that kind of slightly confusing thing just does to some degree accurately represent both probably how the brain works, in that there's like redundancy and different brain areas doing lots of different things, and the state of the field, in that we don't actually know how things are divided up properly yet.
Yeah, there's some famous saying from somebody who says like, there's no requirement of biology to be simple or something like that,
Right.
Just because we would like it to be. It doesn't have to be. It can be infinitely complex, and we still have to try to kind of put words to it.
There was one other thing that you mentioned just now, which was the redundancy. I was just saying to you guys beforehand that I think that's really interesting as a kind of a partly general theme in the brain, but not completely general, and some of the ways in which it breaks down are interesting. Basically just this idea that like there will often be in any given thing, so in this case sleep wake or switching between different sleep states, there'll be many brain areas involved, and it will be the case that some of those brain areas you can lesion them, and that will cause a short-term deficit. It'll mess up switching between sleep states, but then in the long term it can be that there's reorganization of some kind such that the other remaining areas can take over and you can function normally. So that's kind of an interesting thing that is somewhat general in the brain, but it's not completely general. It's not like you can do whatever you want.
So I actually, on that note, this is a slight digression again from sleep, but I also find it weird how in the neuroscience literature they talk about people compensating for these deficits as though really like nothing is different about them afterwards. I mean,
Right,
I am not a person who has dealt with like a clinical population in any of these cases, right? But like it's really hard for me to believe. Like they mean, like when they say this, I assume they mean like there's nothing so wrong with them that we're going to like give them serious medical treatment.
Well, a lot of times it's like they still pass these very particular cognitive tests that we give them.
Yeah, but those are, I don't know. It's just like, I can't imagine I would be the same if like the regions in my brain responsible for regulating sleep-wake were like destroyed, and then like 6 months later, I somehow figured out how to compensate for that. Like, it's easy to gloss over, and people learn to compensate and think, isn't the brain remarkably plastic? And like, I'm not, I'm not sure that this is.
And you want to make it clear, like, no, their
Well,
life is still shit. Like,
No, I don't know.
it
I mean, I
always
haven't.
seems like
I haven't. Again, I haven't
don't know.
interacted with. Yeah, I don't know. But it isn't obvious to me that like the one sentence in a paper that says, "Oh, and people learn to compensate," you know. And I know that one sentence presumably reflects studies done on people, but it's like it feels like it requires a little bit deeper digging to see if these people are actually totally fine,
Sure, of
or if like they notice differences and they just
Yeah.
learn to adapt like everyone does, or something.
Yeah. I mean, it's probably like there's going to be both things. There's going to be like, it's probably partly continuous, right? Or like where you mess up bits of the brain and there can be compensation, maybe that you don't notice or something. But then, yeah, I mean, presumably if you do something where you can't sleep properly for a month, but then you adapt, it is intuitively hard to kind of believe that you really completely adapt after something that has had such noticeable effects for a significant period of time. But on the other hand, I mean, it is the case that there can be, quite surprising results in lesion studies, say in animals, right? Where, I'm thinking of there's a now well-known set of studies by a professor at Harvard called Ben Sayovetsky, where he did studies of in rats learning stereotyped movements, and then he would lesion large parts of the brain, sometimes the entire motor cortex, at different stages of this process. And at some level of resolution, one of the results was that the motor cortex was not required for the execution of learned, stereotyped, complicated movements, but was required to actually learn those movements in the first place. So there can be these results in neuroscience whereby, I mean, that's not quite a compensation thing, but although there probably is compensation involved if you go into the details of it, but it can be the case that there are these kind of very surprising things where like big parts of the brain that you would think should be centrally involved with something can not be, and can be involved in some slightly different way. So in this case, involved with like learning as opposed to execution. So.
Yeah, and it's definitely something that has sent people kind of down the wrong path in the past in neuroscience, is misinterpreting these kinds of findings because it's like a lack of appreciation for just how complicated it could be. So back to wakefulness cells. There's one last set of relevant cells that are cholinergic cells in the basal forebrain that are, I think, considered like more closely related to the EEG desynchronization. So like their activity, because it directly projects to pyramidal cells in the cerebral cortex and inhibits inhibitory cells in the cortex. It has a large effect on that component. And then something that's weird is that the thalamus, which is like something you would maybe naively consider to be relevant for wakefulness and alertness, because it's kind of this area where kind of all of the sensory signals pass through and can get combined and these kinds of things, there actually doesn't seem to be a connection to sleep in the thalamus, because if you damage the thalamus, people with bilateral thalamic damage will be in a vegetative state, but they will still have normal sleep-wake cycles, which I didn't even know was possible.
Oh, yeah, that is pretty interesting.
Yeah, so I guess people even in like comas still can have sleep-wake cycles. So that was odd. So those are the wakefulness ones. Cells that are associated with non-rapid eye movement sleep. A big group of those is in the ventrolateral preoptic nucleus. And so these are active during sleep, and they innervate basically all of the other areas that I just mentioned that are associated with wakefulness. The structure of this is that there's a core center of cells in the middle that if you lose those cells, you lose non-REM sleep, but then there's this like outer network of cells that if you lose those, you lose REM sleep. And then there's a nearby set of cells that are associated with sleep pressure. So this idea that if you stay awake for a long time, the urge and the need to go to sleep will become stronger and stronger. And so this is a set of cells that are active kind of in relation to sleep deprivation and are active in advance of sleep. And they send inputs to this VLPO area that I just talked about. So that kind of makes sense mechanistically, that the lack of sleep would activate the cells that are associated with sleep. So those are the different areas, and they're all very interconnected. And so there's been a lot of modeling work to try to kind of understand how they interact with each other and lead to kind of stable states, either of wakefulness or of sleep. And then the transitions in between them as well, because basically the fact that these transitions are short, you're not in a prolonged state of transitioning between sleepfulness, wakefulness and sleep. And so basically to model that kind of thing, there are these mutual inhibition models where different populations inhibit each other. And so you won't see there won't be a steady state where both are on. It's kind of as soon as the activity of one goes up, it shuts the other one down. And so you can get these clear transitions between states based on mutual inhibition between these different wake and sleep areas.
So, I mean, basically the computational mechanism that they propose is like a flip-flop gate or switch, which is kind of like a fairly ubiquitous simple model in biological modeling in general. And it's based on like a simple electrical circuit, which is used in like electronics. And I think the reason that it comes up so much is because basically one of the mechanisms that can get this, as you were just saying, Grace, is this two brain regions have connectivity that's reciprocal, such that if one is active, it inhibits the other, and if the other is active, it inhibits the first. And so you get like a winner-take-all dynamics, basically, between two populations. And that's like a simple mechanism, and it's both simple to understand, and I guess maybe it's simple to arise like enough in biology, because like gene regulatory networks also have this. And so this yields this phenomenon of like what's called bistability, which is like, again, like a very simple phenomenon that computational modeling can explain to some extent.
And it requires some like input of decent strength to switch. So if you're in one state, you don't easily switch out of it, if the parameters of the model are correct. And so that's kind of related to a small noise isn't going to wake you up.
But like a big noise would wake you up. And then it's hard to get back to sleep.
Yeah, because you're in that state now.
I guess though the only like caution I would have is like it is neurally plausible that like you have these bistability systems, but also it's a very simple and in some ways quite abstract description of this.
All it describes is like switching between two states. Doesn't capture anything about any of the interesting details of what happens in sleep, right?
Of course, yeah. This is just about whether like one group of neurons is active or another group of neurons is active, and each of those are the neurons that correlate with being in one state or the other. But it doesn't. So it explains the mechanism of switching, maybe at some very like coarse level, but it doesn't explain the details of what it means to be in either state, because of course like a whole bunch of computations are going on when you're awake and also when you're asleep.
That summarizes the general gist of this cycle as it acts on its own. We can briefly touch on some of the kind of external inputs to this cycle. So like the circadian rhythm obviously is relevant for sleep-wake, and there's a part of the brain that has that generates circadian rhythm, so basically kind of generates activity on a roughly 24-hour scale. And that has surprisingly like pretty indirect connections, but obviously like through some connections it gets into the sleep-wake cycle and inhibits the sleep areas and excites the awake areas is the net effect of this circadian rhythm area. There's also this sleep debt that we talked about, and so the mechanism that's proposed for kind of how not sleeping for a long time creates the inability to not sleep, like kind of forces you to sleep. The idea is that the cells that kind of control energy stores in the brain, astrocytes, they, after their energy is depleted, they release something called adenosine, and that gets built up, and that can inhibit the wakefulness areas and activate the sleep areas. So that's kind of a direct mechanism whereby putting off sleep makes you go to sleep. And actually, they talk about how caffeine can block the effect of adenosine. And I just liked because in the paper they refer to it as the wake-promoting drug caffeine. And I haven't heard it referred to so formally.
Also known as coffee.
Yeah, so those are some of the other things. There's also a mechanism whereby stress hormones can interrupt the sleep-wake cycles. And actually, the stress hormone thing was interesting because it did seem like the effect of that was to put you into a state that shouldn't exist, where both the wake and the sleep cells were active or trying to be active. And that's why stress disrupted sleep.
So it's like some sort of, I'm colloquializing speculatively, but that's like you're anxious, so you're like alert and you can't go to sleep, but
you still have sleep debt or whatever, so you're trying to go to sleep. So yeah. Do we want to talk about the proto-consciousness theory?
I think that's what remains.
Yeah.
I think.
Can anyone describe it? In our consciousness episode, I talk about my issue with the use of the word consciousness. I'll give some definitions of what this person is talking about when they're talking about consciousness. They say primary consciousness refers to awareness, general awareness, and perception and emotion, and kind of these base level things that you can be aware of as sensations. And secondary consciousness requires language and is involved in like metacognition and abstract thinking. So if you're experiencing metacognition and abstract thinking, that is called secondary consciousness, according to these definitions.
So, I guess it's also just because this is in the context of a discussion of sleep. So, like, when people talk about consciousness with respect to being awake versus asleep, or different levels of arousal, or in the context of anesthesiology, right? So like there are clear extremes where consciousness is not like a subtle concept, right? You can be unconscious or conscious, which kind of means like awake or not awake.
And in dreamless sleep is the non-consciousness usually.
And well, yes. And so, and like in anesthesiology, if you are put under, right, you are in a reduced state of consciousness, possibly entirely unconscious. And so there's kind of a spectrum of like what amount to like extremely coarse words that use the term consciousness.
So to attempt to summarize the theory, I think it's related to the idea that we were talking about earlier of sleep and REM sleep providing neural activity to kind of train from, to give you something even when you're not having experience. It's that idea, but about consciousness. It's like trainer consciousness. It gives you an area to explore consciousness. And particularly they're talking about, so we gave the definition of primary and secondary. Their claim is that dreams contain primary consciousness. Dreams don't contain metacognition or abstract thinking. I think that's not obvious. I think that I've had abstract thinking in dreams. And they even, so they make that claim, and I thought, I don't know. And then it says, like, in parentheses, see figure 1. And I was like, oh, okay, like someone's going to prove to me that this is true about dreams. Figure 1 is a Salvador Dali painting that's meant to describe, I guess, his dream. And that's supposed to be evidence that dreams are about primary consciousness. So I don't know if there's actual solid evidence that dreams primarily, I mean, obviously people associate dreams as being like very emotion laden and, vivid, but maybe those are the ones you remember more. I certainly have had dreams that are like me thinking something, and those are kind of the worst because then you can't remember if that was a dream or not. If you find out something in a dream that's very mundane and cognitive, it's hard to remember that it was a dream.
Yeah, that's a good point about what you remember. But I don't know. As a rough guide, this seems not totally in the wrong direction. Like, dreams are less interestingly conscious, usually, at least the ones we remember, than awakeness.
I don't know.
They're a bit more fuzzy and sensory, kind of.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
I definitely have had dreams where I have thought. I've also had, but he does also talk about lucid dreaming later on, so he kind of acknowledges the existence of these, of some type of spectrum,
Yeah, I mean, my only reluctance around this is that if I dream when I'm asleep, it feels very much like the kind of conscious experience that I have when I'm awake. Like, it feels, I mean, maybe I'm just weird or something, but I mean, it sounds like at least maybe all of us have had metacognition. Like, my dreams, I'll be in some weird situation. I'll be thinking like, this is a weird situation. Why am I in this situation? And so it isn't so unthinking. Yeah, it's not like I'm just like plopped into some situation and I like behave like a philosophical zombie. Maybe that's not what he's...
Yeah, it's true.
Like, I feel like when I'm in a weird situation in a dream, I approach it, sometimes you don't question the premises of being there, like in a deep way. It's not like, this is impossible. I couldn't be in this situation.
Yeah.
But it is more...
Yeah, right.
but you know,
there's a sense of the uncanny kind of a lot of the time. I mean, and insofar as he associates primary consciousness with, I mean, you know, in a sort of, he not explicitly, but he says, you know, at the very beginning, he says about primary consciousness, he says, as such, it can be ascribed to most mammals. And I definitely would say, like, if that's what, like, if the thing that I'm supposed to be experiencing when I'm in a dream is meant to be the state that animals are in, I mean, maybe it could be interesting to think of. Maybe that's kind of what it's like to be a dog or something.
Yeah, that
it's
would
like,
be surprising.
This is a little weird, but I'm not really in control because I'm a stupid dog, you know. But like, I don't know.
Yeah, I think
I tend to think of
the strong version, or the almost tautological version of what he's saying, is that because when you're dreaming, you don't know that you're dreaming, you're not appropriately using your metacognition. Because he said, there's a quote that he says, is like, dreaming is deficient in its failure to recognize its own true condition. So like almost
That's
by
a good
definition,
summary.
yeah, a dream is deficient in secondary consciousness. I think it's complicated, and I see why lucid dreaming is then kind of considered not deficient, because the notion of lucid dreaming is that you are aware that you're dreaming, but you still continue to dream.
Have you guys ever had that?
I've had lucid dreaming.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been accidentally knocked into it. I think there was a period of time when I really wanted to lucid dream, and I didn't lucid dream at all during that period of time.
Yeah, I don't think you can will it.
Well, no, I mean, people claim you can, but it's just like I dream, like, it. You know, it's just like sometimes I dream, and some subset of those I become aware of it and don't wake up.
I have this like strong. I've definitely had dreams where I was kind of like, I think I'm dreaming or something like this, but like I have this strong notion of lucid dreaming where you're kind of like you develop certain levels of like control or something, like in the way that you know, is this a myth? Does this exist? Have you had that, Grace?
Yeah, so I think this is related to the idea of like, if you were properly using metacognition, you would know that you were dreaming when something ridiculous happens. Because the times that I've had lucid dreaming, and where I've been able to like wrestle some kind of control over the dream, not to be like a major downer, but it's when my dad shows up in a dream because he died. And so it's like, that's a strong enough thing where I'm like, oh, this is a dream. And then I decide what I want to do with that.
Interesting. I see. Huh.
So, I mean, it's interesting, and you know, like at least at a psychological level, in the sense that it's like a strong enough shake to like, this is something that you recognize.
Powerful,
it's like powerful, and it has some sort of...
I guess it means that my metacognition kicks in enough. Yeah.
I was gonna go a slightly different direction. That's
Please
more.
do.
That's more like it's only vaguely depressing, but in a more comical way. Which is that I think I dream much less frequently now than as a child, and I wonder if
that
it's...
would be consistent with the studies that say REM sleep is much more common when you're a child.
Well, I was thinking about it as like, at least, you know, maybe this is just wrong, but like, maybe I've gotten like more efficient at sleeping, but like in a sad way. Like as a kid, you have the spare time and liberty to be frivolous.
It's the same amount of time though. Whether
I think
you're dreaming or not.
I like thinking about this stuff. I mean, we were talking earlier about like wishy-washy, speculative, whatever. So here I go. But I like thinking about this stuff in terms of like, you know, like what kind of utopian futures might be like. You know, I've gotten very.
And so the utopian future would be that like adults will dream, you know, creatively or something.
Yeah, or like dream, or like maybe like states of consciousness will become more graded and controllable. You know, like so you'll be able to like kind of inject little bits of like dreamy shit into your reality or whatever. Like, because I think kids are kind of like that. I feel like they're like at a certain age when they're young enough, like they're not experiencing the world in like a normal, controlled way.
Yeah, and this thing claims that kids don't have adult-like dreams until age 5, or like 5 through 8 is when you start. I don't know what counts as adult-like, maybe like narrative or something, but that feels consistent. Like everything is kind of a blur between reality and a dream for them.
Right.
But this is why I want augmented reality. I want to wear like glasses that, you know, make things like float and, you know, whatever, have magical dreamlike things around me all the time.
Yeah,
I want that too.
I totally am not interested in that.
Well, that's good because you don't have to wear the glasses.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Is there anything else to say about this? I don't feel like we explained it well, but I think it's because I was honestly confused about it.
There was something that he said that I thought was kind of wild and funny near the end. He says, the REM sleep dream proto-consciousness hypothesis proposed here suggests that the development and maintenance of waking consciousness and other high-order brain function depends on brain activation during sleep. So that's what you were saying, Grace. It's like the practice, but for consciousness thing. The hypothesis places an emphasis on the primary aspects of consciousness, the basis for which it is posited arises late in evolution and earlier in brain development, then do brain substrates that support the secondary aspect of consciousness. Blah, blah, blah. He makes this statement somewhere, I can't find it, but he makes a statement that like that we should potentially think of like consciousness as something that is like being developed over your whole life.
Yeah, I mean, that's
It's
kind
like-
of what this would have to be. It's like claiming that dreams are a playground for consciousness where you learn from them. But that makes, I don't know,
Yeah.
would that
Basically
mean...
where consciousness becomes a skill, But maybe it's related to Josh is not dreaming anymore. Like maybe Josh is really conscious now. Right?
Yeah, okay. That's...
But shouldn't that mean that you lucid dream more as you get older or something?
Yeah, I guess it would. I guess maybe it would imply that. I don't know.
There are, I'll go off on my rant now. I mean, there's all these like very loose colloquial notions about consciousness. When you get like, into like the sort of Zen Buddhist consciousness kind of discussion,
Yeah.
it would be like the person who doesn't dream and can calm their mind and not think at all is most conscious, which is almost like the opposite of this theory.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like... Maybe that I don't have dreams and that I can focus my attention while awake means that I'm like more conscious. Whereas this guy has a more kind of like, playful mind and is like, yes, I think that like painting Salvador Dali paintings and having dreams where like I'm creative and stuff are signatures
No.
of me being consciousness or me being...
I was reading his thing as being the same as the Buddhist thing.
Oh,
I thought
you
he
think
was
so?
saying that like, because it's like it's practice for consciousness. So maybe like, and like kids are doing it a lot, but they're not conscious, right? And you do it less as you get older because you've gotten better at being conscious. So maybe it's like when you've reached like full consciousness, you don't need to dream anymore because you're done practicing or something.
Yeah, I didn't read it that way in the sense that people could always get better, and so like people who were highly
Yeah, so you should
conscious
just
would be
keep-
practicing a lot or something like this. I don't know. It's like it verbally has the trappings of maybe seeming like a concrete proposal or something vaguely falsifiable, but like when you probe it, it's like...
Right.
I'll read the quote that I thought was funny at the end of the paper, which is, the concepts advanced in this review are directly related to one of the greatest challenges faced by modern science. What is the mind and how can it be described in terms of brain function? Which is like an extremely lofty way for this
For
paper.
like a 10-page review.
But it is also a weak claim. In a certain sense, like the concepts are related.
That's true.
Also, it says one of the greatest challenges faced by modern science. What is the mind and how can it be described in terms of brain function?
Neuroscience isn't all there is. There's other great
No,
challenges.
it's true. Yeah. But it's he's not taking it for granted that consciousness is the only important question.
Right, which is generous.
Are we happy? That might have been fine, right?
I think that's good.
Anything else, Connor?
Nah, I'm done. I'm
Okay,
done.
we're done.
Hey, if you're still listening to this, you must really like us. So how about you go to iTunes or Stitcher and rate the podcast, give us some feedback. You can also go to our website, unsupervisedthinkingpodcast.blogspot.com. You can comment on different episodes, or you could give us ideas for new topics you want to hear about. We would love to hear from you. Thanks.